Ready to go?
Yep, go for it.
Okay, so in case any of you don't know me, I'm Kirralise Hansford. I'm a PhD student at the University of York in my second year, and the paper I'm going to be presenting today is one that I wrote with my supervisors and was published about a month and a half ago. I think it was the first paper from my PhD, and it's on the topic of how finger stretching can help chronic pain. As you can see by the bottom right-hand corner, there's the Pain Relief Foundation logo, which is who funds my PhD and sponsors all the research. And if you want to keep up with any of my research outputs or anything, and you happen to have Twitter, then there's my Twitter logo at the bottom, but no pressure for following. It's just in case you want to keep updated. So
it's an X now, not Twitter.
It's true. It is just X. That is very true. So the paper I'm going to be presenting was published in Neuropsychology, and it's titled Distinct Neural Signatures of Multimodal Resizing Illusions, which is a bit of an annoying title. But what it basically means is we were looking at what happens in the brain during finger stretching. And importantly, in this paper, we were looking at it in people without chronic pain. So I know this is a chronic pain focus group, journal club, sorry, but this paper was specifically looking at what happens in a population without chronic pain, so we can use it as a basis to then do future research with chronic pain populations, because there's no point us getting loads of people with chronic pain in to take part in a study without any basis or backing of theory as to what happens without chronic pain. So as a background to the study, we used illusory body resizing, which is just when you change the size of a part of the body, which typically uses a process called multisensory integration, which is just the incorporation of several different senses. So this could be sight, vision, taste, sound, anything like that, to change the perceived size of a body part. And multisensory resizing illusions have been found to reduce pain for individuals with chronic pain. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to touch on a little bit more of the background about how these illusions reduce pain. And this work isn't in the paper, but I thought it's a useful background for the journal club. So research in 2016 found that people with chronic pain might have cortical misrepresentations of their bodies, which just means that their brains might misrepresent how their bodies are perceived. And there's also been research done which finds a lack of concordance, so a lack of similarity, between the physical damage to someone's body and the symptomatic pain that they experience. So both of these taken together highlight the possibility of there being cortical misrepresentations, so differences in how your brain perceives your body, which could drive pain rather than structural damage. So rather than an injury that might drive pain as an acute pain, chronic pain could be driven by cortical misrepresentations. So it shows that instead of looking to the body, which is where a lot of theory and therapies are based on so far, it might make sense to look at the brain instead. And this is not saying by any means that chronic pain is all in your head. It's obviously not the case, but it might just be that changing the way we think about chronic pain and changing the way we treat it might lead to some new avenues to improve living with chronic pain. So there are two main theories as to why these resizing illusions might work for individuals with chronic pain. So the first theory is a somatosensory blurring hypothesis. So somatosensory just means like integration of senses. And this theory says that the cortical representation, so the brain representation of a painful body part, can be blurred. And viewing the body part in these resizing illusions might sharpen the representation. And it's this sharpening of the representation that could reduce pain. The other theory is a magnification theory, which says that the cortical representation of the painful body part, instead of being blurred, is reduced. And this representation can be increased through magnifying, thereby stretching a body part, which could reduce pain. So these are kind of in opposition to each other. And this paper doesn't say which one's right or which one's wrong, but it's looking at these ideas as to how chronic pain is reduced through resizing illusions in a non-chronic pain sample to just find out what's going on in the brain during these illusions. So continuing on with the background of the current study. So we found that previous studies have associated multisensory body illusions, so illusions that use more than one sense, with frontal theta oscillations. So frontal is just the front part of the brain, and theta is just some sort of activity you can measure with brain neuroimaging devices. And they've also been associated with parietal gamma oscillations, and gamma is just a different range of frequency you can measure in the brain, for disintegration and integration of these multisensory signals. So frontal theta is linked to disintegration, and parietal gamma is thought to be linked to integration. However, there have been some recent studies that also support illusory changes in these kind of resizing illusions from unimodal visual stimuli, so from only using visual input rather than this multisensory input that I've been talking about so far. So in our study, this is where I get to show you the cool video. So in our study, we used augmented reality to change the size of participants' fingers to see what happens in the brain when they're given a multisensory resizing illusion, which here consisted of visually seeing your finger stretch and having a tactile input of someone touching and pulling your finger, compared to a unimodal visual version of the illusion where participants had only a visual input of the finger stretching, but no tactile input. So I'll show you this video now. This is what the participants would have seen during the experiment. This is the participant's finger you can see so far. And then when I show the video, my hand will come in and apply the tactile manipulation. So the finger visually stretches as it's being pulled. And once it's in this elongated state, it's able to move around the augmented reality system. And the aim of our research was to gain a more comprehensive understanding of what happens in the brain during these resizing illusions for people without chronic pain, as I say, as a basis to use for later investigations in my PhD and other people's work with chronic pain populations. So we had 48 participants, which is quite a big number for neuroimaging studies. Most of these were female, and most of them were between 18 and 21 years, and that's because we used an undergraduate psychology sample, which most studies use. But importantly here, because we're looking at what happens in the brain during these illusions, we don't have the issues that some behavioral studies had with the misrepresentation of, lack of representation of males, or a lack of representation of different age groups, because the brain isn't as different as behavioral is. So the image you can see on the far left, I think it is on my screen, it might be on yours, is of an augmented reality system. So participants sat on the stool and they placed their hands onto the black felt in between the white dots to guide where their hands need to go. And the researcher was on the other side. There's a camera within this bottom part of the system, which sends a live feed of their hands to the computer screen, which is on the top. And this is then reflected on the mirror. And participants are instructed to view their hands from the mirror point of view, not from where they actually are, so that they see the augmented size of their hands and were able to induce these resizing illusions. They had EEG caps on throughout, so that's just the cap you see at the bottom to measure those brain waves I talked about earlier. And we had 4 different conditions. So we had a congruent visual tactile condition, which is like the video I showed you before, where as the finger stretched, we pulled on the finger, or as it shrunk, we pushed on the finger. There was a unimodal visual version where the finger stretched or shrunk without any tactile input. There was then an incongruent visuotactile condition where it's opposite from what you would expect. So as the finger was stretching, we pushed on the finger, or as it was shrinking, we pulled on the finger to act as almost a control. And then we had another control condition, which was a non-illusion baseline where the finger didn't change size throughout. And there was no visual or tactile input. Participants then completed a subjective illusory experience questionnaire, which we gave to them at the end of having done lots and lots and lots of these trials. And we asked them to think about the trial they just experienced and those they'd experienced previously that were similar to answer these questions. So we had the first 2 questions relating to illusory experience, where they had to rate from -3 of strongly disagree to +3 of strongly agree, as to whether they felt like their finger was really stretching in these illusions and whether they thought that the hand they saw was part of their own body. We then had 2 questions relating to disownership, where they responded on the same scale, whether they felt like the hand no longer belonged to them or whether they felt like the hand was no longer part of their body. And we had 2 further control questions saying it felt as if my hand had disappeared, or it felt as if I might have more than one right hand. So typically, we would expect participants to respond quite strongly to the illusion questions, saying that their finger was stretching and they thought the hand was still part of their body. But for the disownership and the control questions, we'd expect them to respond quite disagreement, because there was no reason for them to experience this, but it was like checking that they experienced the illusion, checking they completed the questions correctly, for example. So what did we find? Well, for our first hypothesis at the top, we thought that illusion strength, measured by that illusion questionnaire, would be greater in a multisensory condition compared to a unimodal visual condition, and that the unimodal visual condition would be greater than that incongruent control condition I showed you earlier. So paying attention to just the left side of the graph, so the A, that's quite small, but A at the top, that side of the graph to start with, we saw greater illusory experience, so a higher number in the multisensory condition here in blue, compared to the unimodal visual condition here in purple. And this was a significant difference in line with our findings supporting our hypothesis. But as you can see here in that purple group, a lot of the dots, which are the individual data points, were below the 0 mark, which shows they didn't have an experience of the illusion in the unimodal visual condition. So we looked at other literature, and other literature found that around 30 to 40% of participants experience resizing illusions with only visual input. And we found very, very similar. We found 27% of our participants did, and the rest didn't. So on the right-hand side of the graph, what we did is we used that subsample of the 27% that did experience it to see their representation of the illusion. So in this subsample, we saw a greater illusory experience in the purple, which was the unimodal visual, compared to that green incongruent condition, which is opposite from what we saw in the whole sample, which supported our hypothesis. This was not a significant difference, it's important to note, and it's because it was quite a small sample size as well. So this needs to be replicated in other work with people that do experience a unimodal visual condition, but at least here we do seem to differentiate the effects of different types of presentations of the condition with different groups of people. So moving on to our neuroimaging results, our second hypothesis was that we would have stronger parietal gamma band power, so in that blue section of the brain, during multisensory compared to unimodal visual conditions. And this is because multisensory conditions involve an integration of senses, whereas the unimodal doesn't. So the red dots here on those little head plots indicate significant clusters. So all you need to know is that the red dots are where something is significantly different between the two conditions, and the two conditions are seen at the bottom in that infographic. So as we can see on the graph at the top, we saw an increase in the end of the time point in gamma band activity in the congruent visual tactile condition, as we expected, which supported our hypothesis. Importantly, however, because we had that subsample of participants at the beginning, we wanted to see if the ones who experienced an effective unimodal visual condition had a different neural presentation from those of the whole sample. And that is what we found here. So again, the red dots indicate significance, a significant difference between the conditions. And here we actually see a decrease in this gamma band activity rather than the increase we see in the whole sample. And the importance of this is that it highlights the importance of individual differences for when we move on to use this in a chronic pain sample. So showing that some people who experience the illusion, showing only a subset of participants experience the unimodal visual illusion, and they also have a different neural signature is important for showing those individual differences. For an offering a therapy to chronic pain samples, we would expect a similar level of individuals who experience it differently and therefore have a different neural signature. Our final hypothesis was that we would find greater frontal theta power, so that's at the front there in green, elicited during those incongruent conditions. So the ones where as your finger got longer, we pushed, or as it got shorter, we pulled, compared to the non-illusion baseline condition where no stretching happened. So once again, the red dots are the significant difference. And you can see here on the line at the top, we saw an increase in the theta activity in the incongruent condition compared to the non-illusion condition, supporting our hypothesis. So what does this all mean in more layman's terms? So to conclude, when asking what's the difference in illusory experience between the different conditions we presented, we found that there was a greater experience of the illusion in the multisensory condition, the one that had visual and tactile inputs, compared to the one that just had visual inputs. But we found that importantly, that unimodal visual condition still presented a greater illusory experience than the control conditions when it was effectively experienced. And the importance of this is because in terms of implications for chronic pain treatments, the unimodal visual option is the most accessible version of this illusion. And that's because you don't need a researcher there to pull on the end of your finger. You can just view your finger getting longer. So it can be used with a mobile phone app rather than a big augmented reality system in a lab. And it can be used at home rather than traveling to universities. So that's a really important finding, that for that unimodal visual condition, we see a distinct difference between subsamples of participants. In terms of what happens in the brain during these illusions, as mentioned, we found an increase in the gamma band activity in the congruent visual tactile condition, which is the video I showed you right at the beginning. And this gamma band activity is thought to be an index of multisensory integration. So it's the area in the brain that integrates that visual and tactile input. We also found an increase in the theta band activity in the incongruent control condition, so the one where the pulling and pushing was opposite from what you'd expect. And this is seen as an index of increased cognitive load. So your brain has to work harder when it sees things that it's not used to seeing or not expecting to see. And we saw that index through this neuroimaging data. And overall, from this, we have a greater understanding of what happens in the brain for people without chronic pain during these illusions, which we can then use, and we are using, as a basis for future research in a chronic pain sample to compare the differences between the two groups of people with and without chronic pain undergoing these illusions. And that is the end. I appreciate it's a lot, so I'm happy to take any questions, but I'll stop sharing my screen.